Welcome back, and I am pleased to welcome our second panel of witnesses who are attending remotely today. They are Louisa Macdonell, Chief Executive, and Linda Gillespie, Programme Manager for the Community Ownership Support Services, both at the Development Trust Association Scotland, and Mick Doyle, Head of Programme, and Fiona Garvin, Director, both at the Scottish Community Development Centre. I want to thank you for taking the time to answer our questions today. As you may have already heard, members will be asking their questions in a pre-arranged order with any supplementaries taken at the end. It would help broadcasting if members could indicate who in the panel their questions are addressed to in order, and if everyone could allow broadcasting a second to operate their microphones. I say to our panellists that if you think another panellist has already given a good and very thorough answer to a question, it's perfectly okay to simply say, I agree, and we can move on to the next question. You don't all need to answer every question. So I'll begin by asking what progress you believe has been made towards community empowerment since 2015. Would anybody like to kick it off? It's going to be a short session today. That's what I like to hear. Linda Gillespie.
Part 5, asset transfer in the Community Empowerment Act. And I think the provision in the Act in Part 5 has been a very positive addition. And I think by creating that framework for the transfer of asset confidence, their view of what's possible. And it's obviously opened out the rest of the public sector to communities in terms of the assets that they may have an interest in. So from that point of view, I think it's been a very good kind of step to that.
Thank you very much. Does anybody else want to add to that? Okay. Whether you think the ownership of an asset is necessarily the best way to help communities become more empowered. Louisa Macdonell. Are people hearing me okay?
Hear me?
Yeah.
Hi. The ownership of an asset is a means to an end. Our Development Trust members, and we've over 300 of them throughout Scotland, are community anchors. Most of them own assets. Most of them were public sector assets, but it's not the only route for community empowerment. It definitely helps, and the process by which they go through acquiring an asset can help build that community capacity, but particularly community confidence to take on additional projects and to look around and see what else is in their locality and how they can contribute to regeneration. So I think it definitely has helped. It's a beginning, as Linda has stated, and also the previous panel stated, their door is open. But this has been going on for quite a long time. It's not just as a result of the Act, but I think the Act has increased the frequency and the awareness of communities that they can regenerate using assets to improve their community.
Okay, thank you. And Mick Doyle or Fiona Garvin have any comment regarding this? Fiona?
Yes, I'll come in on that, Chair.
Okay.
I think it very much depends on what communities want to do. I think the Act, in many ways, what this section of the Act is doing is trying to increase the nature of community control that's available to communities to enable them to do the sort of things that they want to do. And very often ownership is the right way forward for that. But sometimes what communities want to do doesn't require ownership, but it does require increased access and use to an asset, whether it's a building or a vehicle or whatever. And the Act obviously had the leasing and use options added as it was going through Parliament initially. And I think that we feel it would be helpful to maybe restate the fact that those options exist and to try to ensure that all options are properly understood by communities, and that the capacity building work we all do and other investment in that enables that to take place, so we know folk are going for the best route that they want to, or that they need to take forward their aspirations and create the best outcomes for the folk that they're delivering for.
Okay, thank you for that. Fiona?
Yes, just going back to the question about overall, has empowerment progressed? And certainly since as a result of the Community Empowerment Act coming into legislation, certainly we see that as a very positive step because it puts the rights of communities to participate firmly in a legislative footing. So from that point of view, we think it's an important step forward, but we do think it's quite early days to be able to assess the impact of participation requests. They were obviously new, asset transfer predated the Act, but participation requests were a new measure. And we also think that it's quite difficult to evaluate them or review them without looking also at Section 2 of the Act in terms of the duties on community planning partners to foster participation and widen community engagement, around, locality planning and local outcome improvement plans. So from that point of view, we think it needs to take place. A review of participation requests can't really be seen in isolation. It needs to also take account of how well the duties in Section 2 are actually supporting participation and also addressing and involving people from marginalised communities and people who experience inequality of outcomes.
Just further to that, then, can you see any evidence that so far it has helped to involve those marginalised communities?
Do you mean the participation request part or Section 2?
Well, really, we're dealing with Section 3 and 5, but I mean with Section 2 and Section 3 together. Okay.
In terms of Section 3, I mean, I defer to Mick for the detail in that, but certainly overall, I think with the vast percentage coming from community councils, the participation requests has tended to come from groups who are more organised and probably less, certainly a lot less from population groups, mainly locality based. So yeah, I don't think the evidence is clear yet in terms of it actually being used by marginalised and disadvantaged groups to a high extent.
Okay, thank you for that. Mike, have you got some information there? No. Okay, I'll just move on. Sarah?
Thank you very much, Convener. Welcome to members of the panel. We just had an interesting first panel session where we talked about the findings of experience on the ground since the Act was implemented. Now, I note that the SEDC did some promotional work in 2017 to encourage people to engage with the Act and to support them. What would be your findings in the 3 years since? We've heard some suggestions about having a named officer, that you would be your first point of contact, scaling up people within public authorities, as well as support for community groups. Have you insights yourselves from your experiences about what needs to change?
Hi, yes, can I just start saying we have offered support over the past couple of years, but I think it's important to be able to appreciate the extent of that support. I mean, certainly, particularly, and it's been around participation requests particularly, we've really only been able to offer some support in the past 2 years, and that's really, I mean, it equates to around about, a part-time post. And so what that doesn't allow us to do is to engage with groups across the board or at a local level who are looking to submit a participation request. It's limited to us being able to give information, disseminate information across the board, but it's dependent on communities being able to pick that up at a local level and that, that information being communicated to them by skilled practitioners on the ground. We see, I know that this came up in the evidence session in the morning, but certainly where we see a gap is being able to have that skilled community development and support to help people navigate through participation requests, and also actually be able to inform them that they exist and they can be used as a mechanism for community empowerment. So in terms of our own learning, it is limited in that respect, other than to say that a gap is that access to skilled community development support, and that the recommendation from the evaluators at Glasgow Caledonian University, we would agree with that named contact, not just someone who knows the practicalities, but who is culturally orientated towards the principles of community empowerment and can work within their own public sector body is an important part to make the Act have the impact that it's set out to do.
That's yes. I can see you'd like to come in as well.
Mr. Doyle.
Yep.
Yeah, thanks very much. I mean, building on Fiona's comments, I think that I'd say it's quite disturbing how often we go out to do promotional work, and there are a number of groups in the areas and key roles who don't really know much about the Act and don't know much about its potential. What we find is that once we raise that awareness, there's a high degree of desire to engage with the principles of the Act. And I think it does, however, raise some issues about how successful public agencies have been about getting the message out. And I think that very much chimes with the Caledonian experience, that within the public authorities, there'll be people who would like to do more but don't feel they've got the resources, and austerity is a factor there. There are sometimes cultural issues, but there's also a lot of progressive staff who are really keen to have a proper participatory environment. And the reason we've raised the issues around Part 2 is that I think participation requests are more likely to have an adversarial dimension if other elements of the participatory landscape aren't working properly. And that's why it's helpful, I think, to think about them a bit more systemically. So I don't know if that helps, but I think there's massive potential in the Act, there's massive desire in the Act, but you need to see its different bits working together in order to create the right outcomes for communities that want to do things in a different way and contribute to service reform, etc.
That's a really helpful answer. Can I follow that up then and say what actually needs to change? You've got the legislation. I'm not saying a massive critique of the legislation as such, but it's the implementation. So is this political leadership? Is it guidance? Is it dedicated funding? How do you achieve the culture change? What do we need to make this Act be delivered in practice? And do you want to just follow that up, Mick?
Well, I can give a few points. I'm sure my colleagues will want to chip in. I would say that promoting the purpose of the Act is definitely one. I would probably echo the points in the last session about, for participation requests, a more active consideration of an appeals mechanism would be helpful. Not so much because we would want everybody to get bogged down in the detail of appeals, but I think that a conversation around that would help create a discipline amongst all folk involved in the public agency side to maybe be a bit more focused on how the requests work, but as importantly, how participation works. And similarly, the point that was made earlier in the last session around gathering evidence of what happens to unsuccessful requests, and if they're referred into other processes, do these processes work? I would say that. I think I would also say maybe some discussion about possible access to legal remedies. At the end of the day, it is a law, so there needs to be that potential, but not again because we want to get bogged down in the courts, but because I think if folk can see that as a possible outcome, it encourages everyone to maybe engage in a much more focused way. And we've raised the issue about the case in South Ayrshire where participation has been a focus of a judicial review in a Court of Session judgment recently, that maybe means that the way we deal with participation requests will have to be taken a lot more seriously. Capacity building, as Fiona said as well.
Okay, thank you. If anybody wants to, raise your hand if you want to speak. Linda Gillespie. Linda Gillespie, please, and can you put her mic on?
Just to build on the point about, just in response to the question about kind of raising awareness, etc. I think the asset transfer, Part 5 of the Act benefited from COSS being operational ahead of the legislation. So I think there is a much higher level of awareness about asset transfer and the potential for that. I think our experience of communities is that they are reacting to threat and opportunity. So it is the threat of losing assets and buildings being closed. And actually, for some, particularly those established organisations, it's quite often the opportunity that an asset brings. So I think there's quite a high level of awareness. The COSS website had 55,000 downloads last year. We haven't had anything like that number of people over the door. But people are clearly looking at it and considering it. In terms of how things can improve, the single point which was raised by SCDC, it's extremely important, and it's also important that that's at a senior enough level that it's not just seen as an administrative post. I think if communities come into a relevant authority and they are directed to estates, then it's a very different type of conversation, and it's generally about price, and it's generally about the value of the asset and conditions that will be attached to that. If you're talking about a kind of multidisciplinary team within a relevant authority, it's a very different experience. And whilst local authorities overwhelmingly are the recipients of the most asset transfer requests, when you come in to look at the NHS assets, you know, if a community is just speaking to estates and NHS, then it's closing down that opportunity when there's a continuation of some form of health service type activity, and they kind of need to be directed within the NHS. And organisations that the NHS are extraordinarily difficult to navigate. So there's a thing about the status of the single point of contact, as well as just there being one.
Thank you. Fiona Garvin, would you want to come in, and then Louisa McDonald?
Yes, thanks. I mean, I think where we see some real potential in the success of the Act is where it's built into the wider community empowerment mechanisms, and we've seen some kind of like, you know, sort of notable cases across some local authority areas where the whole local authority is focused on a community empowerment strategy. We've been brought into some areas to support that kind of work, but we've seen kind of like the whole authority work around an empowerment approach. So it's not just about the Act itself, it's also about other forms of participation, and that might be through participatory budgeting, for example, or local community-led action planning. And the other key to the success of its implementation, we think, is to tie it in alongside some of the other developing policy and legislative sort of mechanisms. For example, the use of local place plans and the new planning legislation, discussions around the review of local governance in terms of involving communities around being influential in the decisions that affect them and so on. So rather than seeing it as an exercise to implement the Act in and of itself, it's to link it into those wider agendas and to use the policy mechanisms sort of in concert with one another.
Thank you. Louisa?
Thank you, Convener. I want to just make the point that it's a two-way street. It's about awareness raising within communities of what they're capable of, and Linda's point that assets predate the Act, so perhaps they have a head start on awareness. But there's also work that the COSS team are doing with local authorities, in particular, around myth busting and education and improving understanding within local authorities about the process, the reason for the process, and how the process can be achieved. So there is work being done. There are a lot of local authorities and other public bodies as well, and the COSS team is full-time equivalent of 5 people. So we are using new technology. We're developing more online tools that can be delivered, be more one-to-many. So there's a process to go through and an education process to normalise asset transfer that works on both sides. And I think that's worth bearing in mind, that it's new for public bodies as well. Some public bodies are very proactive and very much behind this. For others, it's less high on their agendas, but that doesn't necessarily mean there's a systemic issue on it. The other point I'd like to raise is one going back to something you mentioned right at the beginning, which was about asset transfers and more marginalised communities. And it goes into the conclusion from the report about community capacity and cohesion building. I just want to make the point that assuming that a community is challenged doesn't mean to say that there isn't capacity within a community to deliver. Some of our biggest and most successful development trusts are in very challenged areas. So it's not about assuming that wealthier communities can deliver and more marginalised communities can't. It's more complex than that. Easterhouse and Beath are some of our biggest and most successful development trusts, and they are in what would be challenged areas. So there's a different dimension, but capacity or rather I would call it confidence of a community to take on projects, and increasing numbers of projects as the Act progresses and all other policy conversations that I'm involved in with different policy groups and other organisations about how to increase the confidence of communities to increase the community activity is also an issue, and how we do that is also very much part of this. But it's a learning curve for both sides. It's for both for communities and for public bodies, and how to take this forward.
Thank you. Okay, Sarah?
Yeah, that's really helpful.
Right, thank you very much. Annie Wells, please. And can I two things. Can I say to the witnesses, if you want to speak, can you raise your hands, please? And please remember, we don't need everybody answering every question, because we have got a lot still to get through. Thank you. Annie?
Thanks, convener. Good morning, panel. I was just wondering whether you could give us examples of best practice and public service approach to both participation requests and asset transfers. But on the flip side of that, any bad examples of bad practice?
Linda?
In relation to asset transfer, we would see the approaches taken by councils like East Ayrshire, where they brought together their vibrant communities team. So it was a multidisciplinary team that came in to support communities looking at assets, and Murray Council were very active in that way. I think where and this can be across a range of different kind of public bodies, where it's just one point of contact station, then it can just be very challenging for communities to get the kind of asset transfers, kind of any sort of pre-formal asset transfer request discussed. So that kind of multi-service approach from within the relevant authorities we see as a very positive thing.
Okay, thank you. Mick?
Yes, Mick.
I think in relation to participation requests, one of the problems is you don't see the worst practice because the requests are refused and you don't necessarily know very much about them. What I would say about, so I would echo the discussion from the last session and the suggestion from the folk at the Cali that it's good to gather data on that, and maybe it is worth making that part of the return to government as well. But in terms of good practice, I think some of the best ones that we've seen, when we've seen examples of communities being involved in positive conversations about use of land, sometimes on the back of PRs going in after initial planning consent has been requested. There's a case like that in Portobello in Edinburgh over a big piece of land where communities have, it's still ongoing, but the community's been much more involved in the conversation. A wee simple one up in Aberdeen where there had been a period of 3 or 4 years of a group trying to get access to a community flat, something that should have been possible under other processes. They weren't able to achieve that, and they used a PR to get the right folk at the table and quickly got an agreement about the use of a community flat. I think in Western Bartonshire, as Fiona has alluded to, there's a good example there of where they've brought the community into developing their processes for how PRs should work as part of a bigger debate around community empowerment strategy and action plan that they've produced. It's all kind of been delayed now because of COVID, but they put a lot of effort into trying to engage people and thinking, how can we make this work for you? So I think the best examples, I would also cite West Lothian and Argyll and Bute as places where they want to put a lot of effort, I think, into engaging people in joint discussion between the authority and the community groups so that folk have got a common understanding of what they're trying to do. And I think we are certainly supporting some work in both those areas to develop better outcome improvement processes. Because I think they're key to the PR things, not just the request, it's what happens when you're in the dialogue that's helpful.
Okay. Annie?
Thanks very much for that. Just, Mick, on the sort of aspect of outcomes, does any have a sort of a belief or whatever that the Act has narrowed or maybe even widened the outcomes gap between already empowered communities or communities that were less empowered before? Do you think that What do you think the gap is there? Do you think it's narrowed or indeed widened?
I think it's hard to say definitively, but I think it's probably fair to say that the more a community that has a lot of folk within it who are retired professionals, perhaps, and one of the major resources that they'll have as well as their skills is time, is likely to maybe fare better in a process like that than somewhere in an inner city locality where folk, as well as trying to deal with difficult lives, are expected to deal with a really difficult claim and commitment, and in actual fact are often very time poor. So I think there's a sort of backdrop to this that is about difficult processes, and I think with the right support, if we can overcome the barriers that people face to understand the legislative opportunities and use them, then we could probably, between us, with government intervention, public agency support and capacity building support, bridge some of those gaps. Well, it is certainly harder for some folk than it is for others, not least of all because of the language sometimes we have to use around them.
Fiona?
Yeah, just to say that in support of what Mick's been saying, I mean, I think it's difficult to say whether the Act in and of itself has either narrowed the gap or widened it. But basically, again, over the past decade, we've seen, sort of quite a significant decline in the kind of supports to communities that were previously there in terms of skilled community development support. And I think that has to be part of the equation of all that. And also, I think we need to also take into account the fragility of the funding environment for community organisations, some of which are struggling to survive. So those communities who are already organised and who would maybe then naturally go into to submit a participation request as they grew in strength and so on, basically, as I say, they're increasingly vulnerable. So I think both of those things need to be taken into equation alongside the Act in and of itself.
Okay, thank you. Annie?
That's fine, Convener. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll now bring in Keith Brown. Keith?
Thanks, Convener. Just on that last point, it'd be interesting to know if any members of the panel, and thank you for your evidence so far, are able to speak to what they think might be any differences between local authorities on the one hand and other public bodies in terms of the way they've embraced the Act. So you've mentioned things like having a named person, having a cultural orientation towards trying to promote the Act. Are you seeing a difference between non-local authority public bodies and local authorities themselves?
Anybody want to answer? Linda and then Fiona.
From an asset transfer point of view, then local authorities obviously have the experience of transferring assets to communities. They've done it since 2010. They are well aware of what the social, economic and environmental benefits that a community proposal can bring. So the local authorities we have found are well ahead with this. I think there can be a preference within local authorities lease assets to communities rather than transfer. With the public sector, then I think that point's very valid, particularly with organisations that haven't had direct contact with community bodies. So there can be a very pragmatic implementation, and there is actually a very pragmatic implementation of the Act in that people are complying with it. There can be challenges round about communities navigating within the local authority, within the public body, and trying to get into a discussion, because an awful lot of it is just focused on price, and kind of actually any discount that is to be applied to that can be an extremely challenging concept for the wider public sector, whereas local authorities are kind of much more aware of this within the mix.
Okay, Fiona.
our interface and our experience is primarily with local authorities. And so it's actually quite difficult to tell us as regards participation requests. It's difficult to know, do you know what I mean, what resources are within some of the other public sector bodies that are primed and experienced to deal with participation requests should they arise. But we do see some potential in terms of new public health priorities, for example, around participation requests within a health context. But we think that the capacity would need to be there within, and the will would need to be there within those public bodies to allocate people into these posts who could support both the promotion and the support of participation requests should they come in.
Okay, thank you. Keith? Keith?
If I can, given what you said, it does seem the whole focus seems to be, both this session and the previous one, is on local authorities, and yet the Act had a much wider scope than that. So whether it's water authorities, environmental authorities, NHS authorities, various others, there seems to be an awful lot of scope that's not really being tapped into here. And I just wonder if any of the panel are aware of any non-local authority public body that would be a very good example of one which had really embraced the Act and maybe gone out and sold its virtues and made use of it at all, or is there none?
Mick, you want to come in?
Just a couple of examples in response to that. The Aberdeen City Community Planning Partnership has a sort of portal arrangement where a participation request can be submitted to the partnership and directed to the appropriate agency. So the theory being that if it's something that's related to health and social care, that you might have a lead agency dealing with the request, but as the legislation suggests, they can also bring in the other partners from the public agency side to that. I'm not aware of how that's working in practice, but I know that that's there. Similarly, Dundee Council promote in their online materials the fact that the Act applies to different organisations. In the early days of the Act coming on board, we get quite a lot of requests from national parks in the Cairngorms, Loch Lomond, etc., looking to look at how the Act might play out for them. And I'm not sure whether it's run into PRs, but I think certainly there was an interest in taking that forward. So I don't know if that's helpful.
Keith? Sorry,
that's fine for me, Convener, thanks.
Okay, right. Sorry, Linda, you wanted to come in on that point, and then I'll finish you off, Keith.
They're public bodies, and whilst it is still overseas, where we are seeing requests coming in from communities, Forest Enterprise has a very structured approach to responding to asset transfer requests. Police Scotland, just by the nature of their assets, there's quite a lot of men's sheds interested in some of the kind of former police estate. And then there is a bit of an increase coming through from the various NHS boards, certainly for their smaller assets. So there is something about the estates that the rest of the public sector hold that may not necessarily be particularly attractive to community groups, or of a scale that, you know, engaging with a whole hospital site is, you know, people might actually just want to say in what happens rather than actually to take any responsibility, or just they maybe just want a small part of it.
Okay, thank you very much for that, and thank you, Keith. I'll now bring in Andy. Andy.
Thanks very much indeed, Convener. First of all, I'm just wondering, in relation to asset transfer, as Linda Gillespie said, they were happening, and this Act put them on a statutory footing. In broad terms, has that been of benefit, both in terms of increasing the number of requests and transfers and making it clear what the process should be?
Hans? Linda?
Yeah, in broad terms, yes, I think it has. I think it's given communities a sense that they have rights within this. I think fundamentally it's like anything. If you have a public authority that recognises the value that a community body creates by taking an asset on, then you shouldn't necessarily need the provisions of the Act to to actually engage with transferring that asset, the legislative cover to do. I think wider public sector, I think we are seeing increased interest in the wider public estate, which would not have happened without the Act, Part 5 of the Act being in. So I think local authorities have always had the scope to do this, or certainly since 2010. But the wider public estate is potentially quite transformative, but it is still local authorities that communities are reacting to for asset transfers.
Because I obviously there's an issue with regard to the cost of acquisition, and there's been some concerns that community bodies are having to pay tens, hundreds, millions of pounds or whatever for public assets, when in fact arguably these are still being held in the public interest, and there should be a mechanism that enables their transfer at a more reasonable cost. Are there particular issues arising due to the fact that the Treasury Red Book demands market costs, or are compromises being reached?
It is a very contentious area, and it is an area in which the Scottish Land Fund coming into urban communities has been a kind of game changer in terms of providing support for asset acquisition. It has obviously created an expectation that virtually market value is achievable in the transfer of assets, because the Land Fund will fund up to 95%. In terms of the value of assets, there is a problem with how there can be a problem with how the public sector value their assets and the use of that asset in community ownership. So yes, there is quite a bit round about price, funding, valuations, and get into unproductive discussions about what is actually relatively small amounts of money.
Okay, thank you. And in regard to participation requests, this is a question for Macdonell and Fiona Garvin. I mean, you talk about the fact that there needs to be independent oversight and an appeals mechanism. As I indicated to the previous panel, there is provision for ministers to introduce regulations for appeals under Section 31. They've never done so. Have you any insight into why they haven't?
Mick, first.
No, we wouldn't. I think it's the short answer. Why that would be the case, no. I mean, whether it's what's needed is as an external appeal system, or whether a second level of internal recourse might be a starting point, I don't know, but I'm not aware of why that hasn't happened.
Okay, that's helpful. I mean, in very broad terms, if democracy is working, if local democracy is working, the government's made clear in its statutory guidance that participation requests are for processes which are additional to the routine means by which communities can engage with public authorities. And of course, they've got much greater capacity to engage with local authorities because they're democratic bodies elected by communities, as opposed to public authorities whose boards are appointed by ministers usually, and who are not directly accountable to communities. But nevertheless, still some important improvements can be made in terms of how public bodies work with communities. But if democracy is working, should there be any need for these participation requests? And in particular, is this a function of the hollowing out of local democracy we've seen? I mean, before '96 we had district councils, which were closer to people, and before 1975 we had 196 town councils, which were much closer to people.
Fiona?
Yeah, I mean, I think broadly, your point is true. Kind of, if local democracy was working, would there be a need for something like participation requests? I mean, we see them being positive, because even though there are other mechanisms at the moment for communities to engage through local community planning processes, locality planning and so on, participation requests allow and support communities to initiate the dialogue, as opposed to be invited in the process that's there. But where decision making devolved to a much more local level, then it could be that those kind of requests wouldn't require to be made, because communities would be in more control of the decisions that affected their own communities at whatever level, so that might be. So we think it's part of a wider debate. We see, and at risk of repeating myself, I mean, the location of the Community Empowerment Act needs to sit alongside kind of other empowerment measures, and part of that is about democracy and where decisions take place and how, at what local level those decisions take place.
Okay, and finally, I'm just wondering whether, in fact, the kind of outcomes that participation requests have achieved, whether there's sufficient kind of systemic learning going on. So, for example, if a community body makes a request about about to engage on a question about how to improve service delivery or whatever, that may, the outcome may be positive for that community. But is there any evidence that that is being learnt from systemically, not just through that particular public authority, but through all public authorities? Macdonell?
Yes, I don't think there's a lot of evidence of that. I think that would be very useful to have, and I think it's about how we would maybe go about gathering it from this point in, given that I think things are at quite an early stage. I also think that your own point about outcome improvement processes is important, because I think that to have that ongoing systemic impact, a participation request that improves an outcome improvement process also needs to embed that process into the broader participation work going forward. I mean, it's not really a positive result for groups if they have to keep going back to the PR process to get back into the table on relevant things. So I think that idea of learning is critical, because that's where culture is nudged and changed, where progressive officers are empowered as well as communities empowered, and the ongoing shift in ideas that can create proper service reform and the other legislative intent of the Act is delivered, I think. So the learning element's key, something that we're looking at ourselves. We'll be running some learning events this year from that have been displaced from last year's support programme, and another set of learning events with a heavy emphasis on outcome improvement. So I think you're absolutely right about that.
Okay, thank you very much,
Thank you very
Andy. Right. Gail Ross.
Thank you, Convener. Yeah, I was actually going to ask about ongoing learning, and we spoke right at the start about capacity building, and I was glad to hear that somebody actually mentioned it as confidence building as well, because a lot of these community groups, they've never done anything like this before, and the support systems have to be in place to help them go forward. I mentioned it in the question into the previous panel, but to what extent do you think that a kind of mentorship programme with good practice going from group to group, and I know a lot of the community development trusts in my area, they meet each other quite regularly to pass on good practice and points of contact and things like that. So where are we with that sharing of practice, and how do you think that the capacity and confidence building can move forward now? And that's to anyone. Louisa.
Louisa, Louisa McDonald.
Thanks. Yes, we do a lot of that. Development trusts themselves do quite a lot of peer-to-peer support and networking. Ironically, because of COVID and the use of Zoom becoming much more frequent and every day, actually we're able and have been doing increasing numbers of member discussions around particular issues, and that's something that we'll be building on as well. There is also a small fund administered by the Scottish Community Alliance that also enables COSS for groups to go between each other and meet and discuss. So there is activity out there that does support this. It's always challenging to people to find the time. A lot of it, if you're asking for peer-to-peer, because everybody's really busy, especially at the moment. However, it does happen. Could it happen more? Yes, that would need support, but there is quite a lot of activity in this area. So that's, from my perspective, it's a wider thing, and it is very much about confidence building, not just skills. It's about groups being able to take collective decisions. But if I refer you to Linda, she'll be able to give you more examples from the early stage groups and how COSS works with early stage groups who are just beginning the processes of thinking about asset transfer.
Okay. Linda and then Fiona.
Yes. I mean, I think that that point is really well made about learning journeys, and I think there is possibly scope to kind of, well, it's not possibly, there is scope to develop that further and actually kind of use the experience within the network and within communities to support other communities, possibly in a more practical way. So I think there's certainly an area of development round about that peer mentoring and peer support. From a cost point of view, obviously, where there is an established group looking to take on an asset, it's an awful lot, it's a quicker process. They tend to be operating quite strategically, they might well have staff. For those early stage groups, then this kind of peer support and experience is critical, because actually they also need to be very sure that they know what they're doing in terms of what they're taking on. So we do work very closely with groups that are kind of forming to take on assets and use our network of development trusts and also former COSS clients who may not be development trusts in terms of taking groups out to see them.
Okay, thank you. Fiona?
I do think that the learning is important, and certainly it's something that we build into support, is to try and go out to people who are engaged in support and looking to put in participation requests and have experience in terms of bringing them together to try and get some collective learning to then feed back out to the sector. I was also going to mention the learning exchange run by the Scottish Community Alliance, and we support groups to go there. But there are probably more opportunities for learning amongst membership organisations, and certainly for participation requests. These can come from a wide range, diverse and disparate, sort of sets of community organisations, and it's more difficult to be able to support those diverse groups at a national level to then engage in any kind of coherent learning programme around it. So there's something about the difference between those groups who are part of a membership and those who are not, and the access they get to those opportunities or not.
Okay, thank you.
And I think that also individuals that see an opportunity and don't know where to go in terms of to approach my community council, a lot of communities don't have a development trust, although the ones that certainly in my area are hugely proactive and beneficial to the community. So how do we reach those, or how do we widen out that message to people that are maybe harder to reach at the moment, to say, you know, you can be empowered to be part of your community, to then go on and make a difference if you're not already in an established group?
Fiona?
Oh, sorry, convener.
Yeah.
Will I go? Sorry, will I go first? Very quickly. I mean, I think it goes back to that availability of local support. And where there are, sort of people working in and alongside communities at a local level, they can be able to distribute information to them. They can join people up. They can signpost people to other learning opportunities and so on. And where we see a take-up sometimes of the learning events that we put on across the different parts of our programme work, it's where there are people able to signpost communities to them, to those communities who may not otherwise necessarily pick up that support exists.
Okay, now Mick.
Thank you. Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, I think one of the things we think is important is working through trusted intermediary organisations for, groups that have maybe get protected characteristics, and whether it's disability or deafness or language challenges because they come from other countries. So we would, I think it's about being systematic. How do we get to the communities that may need to access the legislation? How do we address the barriers that they experience to understanding what the legislation is for and being able to use it? And also, I think if you recognise that it's about confidence and it's about skills and it's about knowledge, I think it's partly about understanding the starting points, as we were saying earlier, in terms of communities where people might have loads of innate abilities but less knowledge because of the impact of multiple deprivation or whatever. So it's planning for that and providing the support in a way that can compensate for it, so that folk get equitable access to the type of support that's needed to make use of the Act, and share that amongst themselves and develop a bit of solidarity amongst themselves, I think.
Okay, thank you.
And final question, convener, thanks. Obviously, the pandemic has brought communities together in a way that we've never seen before, with community resilience partnerships and various other groups that have formed. How do we harness that and make sure that we don't get, I suppose, volunteer fatigue with the same people doing the same things in different groups, which we do see quite a lot. But you know, these new people that have come forward with a renewed interest in their communities, how do we make sure that we are harnessing their energy going forward now?
Louisa?
It's hard. Hang on. Yes, so I can just see Fiona. It's challenging. The increase in volunteers who've come forward, partly originally through furlough and people wanting to be active, even actually after people have come off furlough and returned, have more numbers of people have come forward and said, I think this is great. I didn't know you were here. I want to carry on being involved. So yes, we have a great increase in volunteers. There's also been a big coming together of community groups in a place, particularly around the Supporting Communities Fund that the Scottish Government put out and how that was administered. And actually, I was talking to one of our Development Trust members yesterday, and he described it as we all used to just be players on a team, but we all wanted the ball, we all wanted to score. What we need is a coach, and when we have a coach, we work as a team on the field. And that concept actually within a place is really powerful. So leadership development within a community, who is responsible for that leadership? Does it matter as long as somebody is doing it? Is an ongoing question. The volunteers coming forward, yes, we want to continue them from a getting stuff done perspective. It's wonderful, and people want to be on board. Communities want to do more. Communities have responded amazingly during the pandemic, and they have shown what they could deliver, and it's worked. And I think that the awareness of the capacity of communities to deliver services and what is needed locally, and that recognition of that real local knowledge and local depth of knowledge is really important. So maintaining the momentum is actually, I think, it is a challenge, but it will also, I think it will happen. And it's really exciting in a way because it pushes on the empowerment of a community to participate or to buy asset transfers, to deliver as a means to an end to improve the places that they live in. So it's really exciting time in a way. It will also be a challenge, and many areas and members and other policy groups are having this discussion as well.
Thank you. Fiona?
Yeah, I mean, I'd just like to add, I think it's been really notable, the response by communities to COVID and their ability to step into spaces in an agile and very, very fast way, where kind of other public services have perhaps not been able to reach quite as quickly. So from that point of view, we've seen real impact sort of on behalf of communities around this. And it is an exciting time, but I also kind of like, I have some caution around it because I think it's a different proposition to become involved in your community in response to an immediate crisis and being engaged in long-term community action and community life. And actually we find that a lot of community organisations, community activists can burn out very easily. They can spend, sort of an awful lot of time trying really hard to make things happen that the system could just make simpler for them. So there's something about just systemically understanding the contribution and the impact that community can make, how they can step into spaces that perhaps reduce impact in public services. And while we recognise all that, what we often don't see is that followed up by a consistent approach to the funding of the sector, to looking at shifting some funds towards communities where they can actually do things better and more cheaply. So there's something about just recognising that just as part of the whole system as we move forward, but also just genuinely supporting community groups to do what they do in an easier and way, and give them the information and the kind of supports that they need to help them do what they do and keep doing it better.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you, Gail. Now we move on to Alexander Stewart.
Thank you, Convener. Can I go back and look at the apparent disconnect that some areas, and an example was given of Perth and Kinross, between the expressions of interest in asset transfer and the actual requests submitted? And can I ask, what is putting them off in ensuring that disconnect it seems to appear.
Linda.
I mean, that's actually a very interesting question, because Perth and Kinross Council have been extremely active in the last kind of 18 months in terms of developing their internal processes across teams. I'm not sure that we've picked up that asset transfers aren't going through, because actually we've got a number of ongoing cases in Perth and Kinross, with quite a lot of support from the public body in that. But notwithstanding that, and I couldn't comment much more beyond that on Perth and Kinross. I mean, it is completely legitimate for a community group to explore an asset transfer and decide that they are unable to make, and to kind of step away from that. And maybe depending on what the kind of funding and the opportunities to generate kind of income, we may well have groups doing that. We will certainly have to have groups taking quite a strategic approach to the assets that they actually regard as assets and those that are kind of liabilities. So we've talked about kind of place plans and local improvement plans, etc. That type of activity will be key to communities, just to actually regard what are their assets. It doesn't really matter who owns them in the public sector, but what are the assets and what are their needs and which assets best meet that. Now, that obviously brings a range of challenges in terms of depending who that public body, the owner of that is. But just for communities to maybe be reacting to the threat of the loss of a service doesn't necessarily mean that they will feel able to actually deliver that service, much as they may want their community centre to remain open, or their public toilets to be functioning, or those types of assets that might be being closed. So that wasn't necessarily particularly clear. Sorry.
That's okay, thank you. Can I also ask about the role that you see for the community planning partnerships? Mick touched on this earlier in one of the previous questions about the capacity of that organisation. It brings together a number of agencies that have the opportunity to then interact within a council setting or a community setting, but it also gives them the chance to impart their role to the community at large. And do you believe that they have a role to play in this whole process? And if so, how that might be bolstered going forward?
Anybody? Mike?
Well, as I understand it, that this legislation was partly an outcome of the review of community planning carried out a number of years ago. It was that was certainly an element of the genesis of the Act, I think, partly because it was recognised that there was a bit of an issue with the relationship between CPPs and communities, and part two certainly tries to deal with that, and that's why we've recommended that. But I do think that there's some evidence in some of the places that we've worked in where the local authority as lead community planning partner has had difficulty perhaps getting sufficient support from other community planning partners to do stuff generally, and in one or two other areas there would be other community planning partners who would take the view that the local authority in its leadership role hasn't been collegiate enough in bringing the CPP partners together. So I'm sure that any support CPPs can get to be working more effectively as a group to engage with communities, and therefore maybe negate the need for participation requests and or make life easier for asset transfers would be a good thing to explore. The details of exactly how to do that would be something that would need further discussion, I think.
But you do believe that there is a need to try and engage more to ensure that transition that takes place amongst some of the agencies, and as you identify, it may well be the council that's the lead. But if there's not dedicated resource capacity funding to make that happen, then once again, as I said at the earlier panel, we're putting ourselves up to fail because we're not managing to achieve the goals and the aspirations and the ambitions that communities want.
Louisa.
I agree that that's really important, and the building of I was trying to rethink this through. If we look at communities as a sector, and we want communities to expand, we want them to encourage them, we want them to do more. That's great, but if this was any other commercial sector, we'd be putting in underpinning support for that in order to make it happen. So if we reframe the conversation as actually how do we help the community sector, then yes, we would look at expanded financial support, confidence support, skills support, opportunity support, and it would be much strengthened if there was a much more holistic way of looking at things. Often we can have a turf war and this is my bit, that's your bit, and it's not joined up. Now, that's not deliberate necessarily. It is just the way things have been. So is there an opportunity now to reset at this point how the system of looking at how communities are involved in conversations, how local authorities involve communities in conversations, how we redo that? I know that the Town Centre Review Panel is discussing this at the moment and hearing evidence from witnesses and written evidence. And this is an issue that keeps coming up as well. If we are asking communities to do more, then we have to broaden the underpinnings of support for them so they have the ability and the confidence to take these things forward.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, then. That completes our questions and concludes this evidence session. I'd really like to thank you all who took part in the meeting for helping identify some key issues for the rest of this inquiry. We will be taking further evidence on the 2015 Act next week. Thank you once again. If you would just like to hang up your phones. Thank you. Bye.
Recording has stopped.
Okay, right. Agenda item 4 is consideration of negative instrument 254 as listed on the agenda. I refer members to paper number 3. The instrument is laid under the negative procedure, which means that its provisions will come into force unless the Parliament agrees to a motion to annul it. No motions to annul have been laid. The Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee considered the instrument on the 1st of September 2020 and determined that it did not need to draw the attention of the Parliament to the instrument on any grounds within its remit. Can you suspend? No. Okay, I suspend this meeting. Agenda item 4 is consideration of negative instrument 254 as listed on the agenda, and I refer members to paper number 3. The instrument is laid under the negative procedure, which means its provisions will come into force unless the Parliament agrees to a motion to annul it. No motion to annul had been laid. The Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee considered the instrument on the 1st of September 2020 and determined that it did not need to draw the attention of the Parliament to the instrument on any grounds within its remit. Do members have any comments on the instrument? Sarah?
Yes. Thank you, Convener. I think this is an important piece of legislation to enable people who've got planning consents to restart development as things move on with the pandemic. So certainly will not be opposing this today.
Thank you very much. Does anybody else have any further comment? In that case, I ask the committee to agree that it does not wish to make any further recommendations in relation to this instrument. Are we agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you very much. That's agreed. That concludes the public part of this meeting, and we will resume the meeting in private on Microsoft Teams. I propose we take a 5-minute comfort break. Please accept the clerk's meeting request for the private discussion, which will be sent shortly. You can exit the meeting by clicking on the red telephone icon. Thank you.